When I released my review of the Canon R7, I saw in the comments below that there was quite some discussions about my video, the comparisons that I did, and if it was fair to compare the R7 to the R5, which costs 3 times as much. And of course I never expected that it would outperform the R5, but the reason why I did this comparison is just that many people want a cheaper camera that is still good for wildlife, has this excellent autofocus, has a bit more reach and everything, or people that already have an R5 and want a second body and maybe can't afford the second R5, or are just wondering if the R7 could maybe add something as a second body that the R5 is not having and would make a more complete setup. A bit like back in the days when we had the 5D series from Canon, which was full frame, a bit higher priced, but usually a bit slower, and on the other hand the cheaper APS-C level and faster 7D series. So in this video I just want to explain why I'm not buying an R7 as a complement to my R5, and also a bit highlighting in which situations I think the R7 would be a good choice for you and where not. When I'm shooting wildlife, things are often happening quite quickly. I need to adjust the settings all the time, and here I just had troubles with the R7. Not because I could not do what I wanted to do, but because the button layout and the whole concept of how you handle and set the camera is quite different from the R5. For once, you have this typical manual dial for changing between the shooting modes, whereas on the R5 you have the digital one. And then maybe more importantly, on the back of the camera, the main wheel is on the joystick instead of around the set button. And you all actually miss a third wheel for setting, let's say, the ISO or whatever. So you can see there are quite some differences. And this is not a problem per se. Even though I prefer the layout and the way the R5 works, I think I would get quite used to the R7, and after some weeks I would get used to that I don't have this third wheel and everything. But switching between the two, I always found myself struggling for a bit, and I know the more you use the camera the quicker this gets, but at least for me it will always take me a couple of seconds to readjust. And let's face it, in wildlife photography these couple of seconds can sometimes mean the difference between getting the shot and missing the moment. Apart from the fact that the R7 only costs a third of the R5, a reason why many people were interested into this camera is because of this APS-C sensor and this 1.6 focal length extender, if you want, due to the crop factor of the camera. And I'm usually shooting with my 600mm lens, and with having a permanent 1.6 crop I think it would be a bit too much, but from time to time I still enjoy having a bit more reach, so I put usually my 1.4 extender in between the R5 and the 600mm, and in this situation I'm wondering, wouldn't it just be better to use the R7 instead of an extender? So I did the tests, and in terms of image quality there was not much of a difference, both performed quite well, but I could not see that the R7 is resolving more details than the R5. And then I did my second test where I compared the R5 against the R7, both without an extender, meaning on the R5 I needed to crop quite heavily to get the same framing as on the R7, and I expect that due to the higher megapixel count in this image, 32 on the R7 versus the around 18 on the R5, I kind of assumed that there would be more detail in the R7 shot. And when I did these tests at 400 ISO, there was a tiny bit of a difference and a slight edge for the R7, but as soon as I raised the ISO to, let's say, 1600, I had the feeling that actually the R5 maybe even had the edge, but it was quite comparable. So for me this crop factor was not really a benefit anymore. And then I was just wondering, money aside, is there really an advantage of having the R5 over the R7? Well, of course there is. The R7 is faster. It's shooting 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter, whereas the R5 is only doing 20. The thing is just, there's a big caveat at this one, because the electronic shutter in the R7 is using quite some rolling shutter, and for some bigger birds against the blue sky or against the water this might be fine, but as soon as you have some structure in the background you can see that this gets easily tilted. And if you're shooting smaller birds or insects, you see that the wings, they start to look kind of weird. So I was having kind of a bad feeling when I was shooting with the R7 in the electronic shutter. I was just not completely comfortable. I even have this feeling sometimes with my R5, but I feel like with the R5 in 99.8% of the cases I'm just fine, so I'm more relaxed. Whereas with the R7 I was always a bit hesitant to put it in the electronic shutter. And you might now say, but the R7 is shooting 15 frames per second in a mechanical shutter. This is quite fast. It's actually faster than what the R5 is doing in a mechanical shutter. So why don't you just use this and be fine with it? Well, while I agree that 15 frames a second is usually enough, the problem is that for me the camera just made a lot of noise. It was way louder than my R5, and this might scare some birds. But even if it doesn't scare the bird, one problem was that there was quite some shutter shock. So just the opening and closing of the shutter was causing some vibrations in the camera. And when I was shooting with a bit longer shutter speeds, I would say like 1/100th of a second, this was really noticeable for me in the field. And I did not really make a one-to-one comparison with the R5 here, but I had the feeling that with the R5 this was never as big as a problem as with the R7. Finally, I obviously do a lot of video, and here the R7 has some advantages, like the less of a problem with overheating. There is no restriction on the 30 minutes, but this was minor things for me, and the drawbacks of the R7 were actually more important to me. And this drawback was mainly that I could not shoot 120 frames per second in 4K, which I like to do a lot to like slow things down. If I have a bird that is cleaning itself, it's fighting, it's flying. And this was also something I really enjoy on my R5 and was missing a bit on the R7. So again, it sounded a bit negative for the R7, and I really feel sorry for that, because I don't think it's a bad camera. I just think I'm the wrong person for the camera. I have the privileged situation that I could afford 2 R5s, and I think for all of you that can do that, I would highly recommend to get 2 R5 instead of 1 R5 and an R7, especially if you earn your living or part of your living with photography. I think there are just some situations where you would miss the shot or something, and for those of you, I would get the R5. If you cannot afford the R5, I would maybe even think about the R6. I feel it's still a bit closer in terms of handling. It offers, of course, the better image quality as long as you don't need to crop a lot. So there you need to see for yourself what your priorities are. And I want to stress again that for the money of 1 R5 you can get 3 R7, so that is quite a difference. And if you were shooting APS-C before, maybe a 70 Mark II, 80D, 90D, the R7 I feel like is a huge step upwards. You get the autofocus, which is more or less comparable to the R5. You get better image quality. If you're complaining about the shutter sound and the shutter shock at the 15 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, hey, at least you get 15 frames per second. Your old camera was slower, and it also had the shutter shock because it was a DSLR. So I think it really depends. For some people the R7 might be great. I still think the naming of Canon was not perfect. I would maybe have called it an R70 or something. I just feel like the original 70 Mark II was in some ways just a bit higher end, even though again I think the R7 will be a great camera for you if you're coming for APS-C, wanting to stay with APS-C but want to kind of dive into the mirrorless world. So I hope I managed to make myself a bit more clear about what I think about the R7, and more importantly, I hope this video helped you a bit if you were deciding whether to get an R7 or not.